Samantha Blake stood in front of the full-length mirror, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the lace veil for the 100th time. The gown, off-white silk, delicately embroidered with pearls and crystals, draped over her slender frame, catching the light from the soft amber glow of the suite. It was perfect. The dress had been custom-made just for her, every detail chosen with the careful attention of someone who knew what it meant to be married into wealth. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. 30 minutes until the ceremony, her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she turned her head from side to side, inspecting every angle. Each movement felt more uncertain than the last, as though the very air around her had grown thick, heavier with expectation. She glanced at the clock on the wall, a gilded, antique piece she and Jonathan had found together at a Paris auction 2 years ago, and noted the time. 11:30 a.m. At this very moment, Jonathan Carter, her fiancé, the man she loved, was preparing to marry her in front of their friends, family, and an entire crowd of the city's elite. A wedding fit for royalty. The guests would be arriving soon, their whispered conversations and gleaming champagne flutes buzzing with excitement, except, something felt wrong. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock, and the soft, distant hum of voices from the hallway outside. Samantha's gaze drifted to the large window, which overlooked the city. Below, the bustling streets of downtown Boston glimmered in the midday sunlight. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking in a slow, calming breath. Everything should be perfect. Jonathan had promised her, he had promised both of them, a life of happiness. She was about to become Mrs. Jonathan Carter, the wife of the richest man in Boston, the woman who would finally have everything she'd ever dreamed of. But why did her gut twist with unease? The phone on the vanity beside her suddenly rang, its shrill sound slicing through the quiet room like a knife. The vibration made her jump, her heart skipping a beat. She glanced at it briefly, her pulse quickening. It was an unfamiliar number, one that wasn't on her list of contacts. She reached for it, hesitating for just a second before swiping it up. A knot tightened in her stomach. "Hello." Samantha's voice was soft, almost tentative, as if speaking to an unknown stranger. "Samantha." The voice on the other end was unmistakable, Jonathan's. But something was off. There was no warmth in his tone, no affection. It was cold, almost distant. Her stomach dropped. She knew it. Something was wrong. Jonathan? Her heart raced, suddenly gripped by the rising tide of anxiety. "Where are you?" "The ceremony's in less than half an hour." "Everyone's waiting for you." A long pause. Then, Jonathan's voice, flat and detached, cut through the air like a razor. "I'm not coming." The words hit her with a force she didn't expect. Samantha's breath caught in her throat, the world suddenly tilting beneath her feet. Her fingers tightened around the phone, knuckles turning white, her mouth dry. She shook her head, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. "What do you mean, you're not coming?" She forced the words out, but they felt foreign in her mouth, as though they didn't belong there. "Jonathan, this is our day. We've been planning this for months." I can't go through with it," he interrupted, his voice emotionless. "I'm sorry. It's over." Samantha's blood ran cold. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in, the air thick with disbelief. She struggled to breathe as the phone slipped from her hand, landing with a soft thud on the marble floor. "It's over." The words echoed in her mind, but they didn't make sense. It couldn't be true. They had made plans, shared dreams, built a future together. How could he do this to me? She felt as though the floor beneath her was crumbling away. Her hands shook as she clutched at the edge of the vanity, trying to steady herself. It was all happening too fast, too suddenly. This can't be happening. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her chest tightening as panic surged through her veins. Samantha, are you still there? Jonathan's voice came again, breaking through the haze of confusion. But Samantha couldn't speak. She couldn't find her words. She tried, but nothing came out. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, her eyes wide, her face pale, her makeup slowly smearing from the tears that had begun to pool in her eyes. Jonathan, the man she had trusted, the man who had promised to love her forever, had just walked away from her. On their wedding day, the phone call ended with the click of a disconnect, leaving nothing but the heavy silence that followed. Samantha didn't even move, didn't even register the faint sound of her breath against the stillness of the room. Her mind was numb, her heart breaking in real time, piece by piece. Suddenly, the door to the suite burst open with a loud knock. A woman entered, one of the wedding planners, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Miss Blake. She stopped short when she saw Samantha, frozen in front of the mirror, her expression one of shock and disbelief. Samantha. The planner's voice was more tentative now, noticing the tremor in her shoulders. Miss Blake, the guests are starting to arrive. It's time. Should I let them in? The wedding is, no, Samantha whispered hoarsely, barely hearing the planner's words. Her lips were dry, her throat tight. She turned away from the mirror, her legs suddenly giving way beneath her. She staggered back, her eyes wild with confusion and pain. No, this can't be real. This can't be happening. The planner, seeing the distress, rushed to her side. Miss Blake, are you okay? Do you want me to call Mr. Carter? We can delay things if you. Samantha flinched, her eyes dark with sudden fury. She whipped around to face the woman, her voice low but edged with venom. Don't you dare mention his name again. The planner hesitated, clearly startled, but backed away quickly. She was silent for a moment, then lowered her voice as if speaking to someone fragile. I'm so sorry, Miss Blake. If you need any help. But Samantha wasn't listening. She couldn't hear her over the deafening silence that filled the room. Jonathan had left her, she had been standing there, preparing to walk down the aisle into the life of her dreams, and in the span of a single phone call, her world had shattered. A jilted bride, abandoned at the altar, in front of everyone who had come to witness the start of her new life. The whispers would start soon, the pitying glances, the endless questions, but there was no one to ask. Jonathan Carter was gone, and Samantha Blake was left standing alone. The clock ticked on, its sound now a reminder of everything she had lost. The days after the wedding, the one that never happened, passed in a haze of numbness. The world outside seemed to move in slow motion, while Samantha remained in a suspended state of disbelief. Jonathan Carter, the man she had given her heart to, the man she had imagined growing old with, had simply vanished. And she, Samantha Blake, was left to face the consequences of a life shattered in a single phone call. She moved out of the penthouse they had once shared. The luxury, the opulence that had once seemed like a dream, now felt suffocating. She left everything behind, the designer clothes, the beautiful furniture, the sparkling chandeliers. It was all a lie. Jonathan had never truly cared for her, and the life they had built together was just a mirage. Now, as she stood in the middle of a cramped, one-bedroom apartment in a rundown part of Boston, she wondered if she had made the right choice. The faded walls, the musty scent, the creaky floors, all of it felt like a cruel joke compared to the penthouse she had walked away from. But in the end, this tiny apartment was hers. For the first time in months, Samantha didn't have anyone to answer to, but she also had no idea what to do next. She walked to the kitchen, if you could call it that, where mismatched dishes were piled high in the sink. There was no housekeeper, no private chef to prepare gourmet meals. Instead, she was living on takeout and instant noodles, trying her best to survive in this new life she hadn't asked for. There were no glamorous galas to attend, no high society events to grace with her presence. Her world had shrunk down to a tiny space, filled with the noise of her own inner chaos. Samantha ran a hand through her disheveled hair and grabbed a glass of water. Her eyes flickered to the empty table where she had intended to sit with Jonathan so many times, just the two of them, laughing and planning their future. But now, the table felt cold and unwelcoming, a reminder of everything she had lost. She had no job. No connections. And the worst part? No friends. Her relationship with her family had become strained over the years, and now, with no one to turn to, she was left alone with her own thoughts. The silence in the apartment was deafening. Was this my punishment? She wondered bitterly. For loving someone like Jonathan Carter, the phone rang, an unfamiliar number. Her heart skipped. She had stopped answering calls from anyone except a handful of people, and even then, those conversations were often shallow, distant. But something made her pick it up. A part of her still clung to the hope that Jonathan would call, apologize, tell her he had been wrong. Maybe he realized he couldn't live without her. But when she answered, it wasn't Jonathan's voice that greeted her. "Hello, Samantha. This is Dr. Curtis. I was just calling to follow up on your recent test results. Is now a good time?" Her breath caught. Test results. She hadn't even remembered making an appointment. The last few weeks had been a blur of shock and confusion. She had been feeling nauseous, exhausted, but she had attributed it to the emotional toll of the wedding fiasco, not realizing something else was going on. Samantha squeezed her eyes shut, trying to steady herself. "Yes, I'm available now. What's the update?" The doctor's voice was calm and professional, but there was an undertone of something that Samantha couldn't quite place. "Samantha, I've reviewed your test results, and I wanted to confirm something. You're pregnant." A long silence stretched out as the words hung in the air, almost suffocating her. Pregnant. The world seemed to tilt, and for a moment, all she could hear was the blood rushing in her ears. She didn't even know what to say. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach, as if she could will herself to understand what had just been said. Pregnant? Was this a mistake? How could this happen? She had been with Jonathan just a few weeks ago, but how could this be real? It felt like a cruel twist of fate. I don't understand," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "How can that be possible?" "I haven't been, Ms. Blake. I understand that this is a lot to process," Dr. Curtis interrupted gently. "But according to the test, you are definitely pregnant. And if you'd like, we can schedule an appointment to confirm the details. But I suggest you make a decision soon." Samantha swallowed hard, her mind spinning. 1,000 thoughts collided in her head. The last thing she expected after Jonathan's abandonment was to find out she was pregnant. And not just pregnant, but carrying twins, quadruplets, as the doctor soon confirmed after further tests. 4 babies. The weight of the news hit her like a brick wall. She had no family to turn to for support, no partner to share this life-altering change with. Jonathan Carter had walked out on her, and now she was facing a future she hadn't planned for. How am I supposed to do this alone? She thought, her hands shaking as she put the phone down. But then, amid the chaos of her thoughts, a quiet determination started to grow. Jonathan had abandoned her when she needed him most. He didn't deserve to know about the children. She would raise them on her own. She didn't need him. She never had. Samantha stood up, walking over to the window and looking out at the city. The skyline of Boston stretched before her, vibrant and alive with possibility, though she could hardly see any of it through the fog of uncertainty clouding her mind. this was her reality now. The life she had dreamed of, the fairy tale wedding, the luxury, was a thing of the past. She was on her own, but she wasn't alone. She had 4 little lives growing inside her, lives she was determined to protect, but even as the determination solidified in her chest, an uneasy feeling crawled over her skin. What would Jonathan do if he ever found out? The thought lingered like a shadow in the back of her mind. Weeks passed. Samantha's pregnancy was progressing faster than she had anticipated. By her 4th month, the reality of the quadruplets was no longer just a medical fact, it was something she could feel, something that changed her every day. She was both terrified and exhilarated, but most of all, she was determined. That I can do this, she told herself every day. She was no longer the heartbroken woman left alone at the altar. She was a mother. A mother who would do anything for her children. Yet, as the weeks wore on, the unease she felt about Jonathan began to fester. Her mind would often drift back to him, his face, his touch, the way he had promised her a future. What if he comes back? What if he wants to see his children? But no matter how much she tried to convince herself she didn't need him, a small part of her feared that he would show up, demanding answers, demanding to know the truth. He had a way of getting what he wanted, and that thought, that fear, wouldn't let her go. 5 years had passed. Samantha had long since stopped checking her phone every morning for missed calls from Jonathan. At first, it had been an almost obsessive habit, hoping, praying that somehow, he would realize what he had thrown away, that he would come back, apologize, and try to mend the broken pieces of their life. But as the months turned into years, that hope faded. She had learned to shut him out. She had no other choice. In the intervening years, Samantha had found strength in the 4 lives she was raising. Emma, the eldest, was the quiet and thoughtful one. Lucas and Noah were inseparable, often getting into mischief with boundless energy. Olivia, the youngest, had inherited Samantha's fiery spirit and was already a handful at the tender age of 3. Despite the challenges of motherhood, despite the overwhelming exhaustion, Samantha had made her peace with the life she had now. It wasn't the life she had envisioned, but it was hers, and it was enough. The children were her everything, and every decision she made from then on had been for them. But peace, true peace, had yet to arrive. It was an ordinary afternoon when the unexpected happened. Samantha was in the park with her quadruplets. The sun was out, and the children were playing, running, laughing, their little voices ringing through the air as they tumbled over one another. Samantha sat on the bench, trying to steal a moment of quiet for herself, watching them with a mixture of awe and weariness. As she scanned the horizon, her eyes fell on a tall figure across the park. It was a man, dressed in an expensive suit, his presence standing out starkly against the more casual attire of the parkgoers. Samantha's heart skipped in her chest, a knot tightening in her throat. It was him, Jonathan Carter. Her breath caught, and she immediately stood up, her body stiffening. She had never expected to see him again, not like this. Not here, of all places. The last time she had seen him had been at the courtroom, after the legal battle, a distant figure whose eyes had never met hers. He hadn't come to check on her, nor had he made any effort to reach out after the case was settled. For 5 long years, he had remained a shadow, lingering on the edges of her life, never truly gone, but never truly there. And now, here he was. Jonathan was staring at her, his cold blue eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach churn. What does he want? Samantha's pulse quickened as she instinctively grabbed Olivia's hand, pulling her closer to the stroller. The other children were still playing, unaware, but Samantha's gaze never wavered from Jonathan. Her heart pounded louder in her ears. He began to walk toward her, slow but deliberate, his face unreadable. The wind picked up, causing his dark hair to ripple slightly, but it did nothing to soften the sharpness of his demeanor. Jonathan was a man who always commanded attention, even when he tried to appear casual. His presence was like a magnet, pulling everything around him into his orbit that he stopped just a few feet away from her, his gaze flickering briefly to the children, then back to Samantha. The silence stretched between them, thick and tense. "Sam," he said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. She didn't respond immediately, too shocked by his sudden appearance to form the words. His name felt foreign on her lips. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was clipped, a mixture of disbelief and anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. "I'm here to see my children," Jonathan replied coldly, his gaze flickering once more to the children, who were still happily playing nearby. There was no warmth in his words, no tenderness. It was almost as if he were making a statement, not a request. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. "My children." She had known, deep down, that one day Jonathan would try to re-enter her life, but she had never imagined it would be like this, unannounced, uninvited, and so unrelenting. "No," she said firmly, her voice rising with a hint of steel. "They're not your children. You left us, Jonathan. You walked away, remember?" She clenched her jaw, trying to keep her emotions in check. "You have no right to come back now." Jonathan's lips twitched, just the faintest trace of a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. But his eyes were hard, cold. "I think you'll find I do have a right, Sam. A very strong one. Those children are mine, and I'm going to make sure I get what's mine." The words struck her like a blow, her heart skipping a beat as a sick realization settled over her. It wasn't just a visit. This wasn't about reconnecting, about apologizing, about finding some kind of closure. Jonathan wasn't here for peace, he was here for something far more sinister. "You're not taking them," she said, her voice trembling now, but not from fear. From anger. From the years of betrayal she had carried with her. "You don't get to walk into their lives after abandoning us for years." Jonathan stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "We'll see about that," he murmured, his tone dripping with something dark, something calculating. Then, without warning, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folder, tossing it onto the park bench between them. Samantha's breath caught as she glanced down at the papers inside. They were official-looking, legal documents, and she knew, without a doubt, that whatever was inside had the power to change everything. Samantha picked up the folder with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the text. It didn't take long for the meaning to hit her like a wave. Jonathan had filed for paternity testing. The words on the paper were clear. Jonathan Carter was demanding that Samantha submit the children for DNA testing to prove that they were, in fact, his. And failing that, he was going to take her to court for full custody, claiming that she had concealed their existence from him. She slammed the folder shut, her chest tightening with panic. "You don't get to do this, Jonathan. You don't get to ruin their lives after everything you've done." His lips curled into a tight smile, and for the first time, Samantha saw something that resembled satisfaction in his eyes. "You're wrong, Sam. I am the one who decides how this ends. Not you." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Samantha standing there in stunned silence, clutching the legal papers as if they were the only thing keeping her grounded. What was this? What had he just thrown at her? As Jonathan disappeared into the distance, the weight of the situation began to settle in. This wasn't about reconciliation. This wasn't even about revenge. Jonathan was after something else, something far more dangerous, control, and Samantha had just been thrust into the center of a battle she never saw coming. The legal papers Jonathan had handed Samantha were a chilling reminder that her peaceful life was about to be shattered. For the first time in 5 years, Samantha felt a cold sweat on her brow. Jonathan had always been a man who knew how to get what he wanted, and it was clear now that he wanted the children, her children. The next morning, after the confrontation at the park, Samantha immediately called her lawyer, Peter Lawson. Peter had been her lifeline during the early days following Jonathan's abandonment, helping her navigate the wreckage of their broken engagement and the ensuing media storm. But this was different. Peter listened to her story in silence as she recounted the incident with Jonathan and his demand for a paternity test. When she finished, there was a long pause. "Samantha," Peter said carefully, "I won't sugarcoat it. Jonathan has resources, power, and a legal team that will stop at nothing. But you have rights too. These are your children, and he has no legal claim over them unless paternity is proven." "But why now?" Samantha's voice cracked with frustration. "Why after all these years? What does he want? Is this some kind of game for him?" Peter sighed. "I can't say for sure, but this is more than a custody issue. Jonathan never struck me as someone who would walk away without some long-term plan in place. He's always been calculating." The realization settled in like a heavy fog. Jonathan's sudden appearance wasn't just about wanting to see his children, it was about revenge. He was using the legal system to punish her, to control her, to make her suffer. But why? What had changed after all this time? That night, as she tucked the kids into bed, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The once comfortable apartment felt too small, too exposed. She glanced at the front door, her nerves taut, and suddenly, the knock came. Her heart skipped a beat. Who would be at the door at this hour? She opened it cautiously, her stomach churning. To her surprise, it wasn't a stranger. It was Jonathan. Standing there, taller and more imposing than she remembered, his cold eyes piercing hers. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice shaking but firm. "I want to talk," Jonathan said quietly, stepping into the doorway without waiting for an invitation. "We need to settle this. You and I both know this isn't over. You can't keep hiding from me forever." "I'm not hiding. You left us, remember? You abandoned me. Don't come here thinking you have any claim to my life." Jonathan didn't flinch at her words, but his expression was unreadable. He glanced past her, looking at the small, cluttered apartment. "How are you holding up? Raising them on your own, I mean. It must be tough." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. Tough. He had the audacity to pretend concern. She took a step back, slamming the door shut with a force that rattled the frame. The next few days were a whirlwind. Jonathan's legal team sent over multiple requests for DNA tests. He had hired a top-tier paternity expert, and the pressure was mounting. Samantha, despite her rage, knew that she had to comply. It was a matter of principle now. She couldn't allow him to take her children from her, but she wasn't about to let him win without a fight. A week later, Samantha found herself sitting in a sterile conference room, facing Jonathan's lawyer, Michael Drake, a slick, sharp-eyed attorney known for his cutthroat tactics. He was everything Jonathan had ever been: confident, ruthless, and entirely without empathy. Drake leaned forward, his fingers steepled on the table. "Miss Blake," he began, his voice smooth, "we're prepared to move forward with the paternity tests, but I need your cooperation. Jonathan has a right to know if these children are his, and as their father, he has every legal right to have a relationship with them." Samantha glared at him. "A right? A right? He abandoned them, Michael. He left us without a word. He has no right to come barging back into our lives after 5 years." Drake smiled thinly. "That's for the courts to decide. And we're prepared to take this all the way. Trust me, Miss Blake. You don't want this battle to go public. It won't just hurt you, it will hurt your children too." Samantha's stomach churned. She had known the stakes were high, but hearing it so plainly made it feel all too real. If Jonathan wanted to make this public, he could destroy her reputation, her life, and her children's peace of mind. "Stop threatening me," she snapped. "I'll take my chances in court." "Very well," Drake said with a slow nod. "But I assure you, this won't be as easy as you think. We have everything we need to win this case." As Samantha walked out of the conference room, her mind raced. She had to think of something, anything, to prevent Jonathan from taking everything. But how could she fight someone like him? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she glanced down. It was Peter. "Samantha, listen," he said, his voice serious. "I just got off the phone with the judge. Jonathan's team has pulled some strings, and they've managed to fast-track the hearing for paternity testing. We have only a few days to prepare for what's coming next. This is getting ugly." She felt her chest tighten. "There's no way I'm letting him win." The paternity hearing was scheduled for the following week, and the tension in the air was palpable. Samantha had spent every waking moment preparing herself and her children for the battle ahead. Emma, Lucas, Noah, and Olivia, all so young, were blissfully unaware of the war brewing around them. But Samantha could see the toll it was taking on her. Her anxiety was rising, and her every instinct screamed that she had to protect her children, not just from Jonathan's manipulation, but from the emotional devastation he would bring if he succeeded. As the day of the hearing approached, Samantha found herself standing at the threshold of a courtroom. The doors loomed before her like the gates of a battlefield. She had never imagined her life would lead to this, standing in front of a judge, fighting for the right to raise her children in peace. Jonathan was already inside, seated at the plaintiff's table, his legal team arrayed around him like vultures. He didn't even look up as Samantha entered the room, his face impassive. The tension was thick, and the air felt suffocating. Samantha walked to her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. She was about to face Jonathan in a way she never expected, not as the man she had once loved, but as a cold adversary. The sight of him, his sleek, well-groomed appearance, his posture of arrogance, made her stomach twist. "Miss Blake," the judge began, calling the proceedings to order. "This is a hearing to determine the legitimacy of the paternity claims made by Mr. Jonathan Carter. Are both parties ready to proceed?" Jonathan's lawyer nodded, and Samantha gave a curt nod in return. It was time to put her faith in the legal system. She had done nothing wrong. Jonathan had left them, and now he wanted to take control. But she would fight with everything she had. The courtroom was silent as the judge motioned for Jonathan's lawyer to speak. Michael Drake stood and addressed the judge, laying out Jonathan's case. He presented evidence from Jonathan's private investigators, documents, and even claims of financial support that Jonathan had supposedly sent to Samantha during the years of their separation, but Samantha's lawyer, Peter, was ready. He stood and countered every point with calm precision, presenting evidence of Jonathan's abandonment and lack of involvement in the children's lives. He even produced a few key witnesses from the time Jonathan had gone silent, people who could confirm that Jonathan had made no attempt to reach out to Samantha during the crucial months after he walked away. The tension between the two sides was palpable. But it was when Jonathan himself stood to testify that things took a turn. "I never wanted to leave Samantha," Jonathan began, his voice smooth, calculated. "But when I discovered she had kept my children from me, I realized she wasn't the person I thought she was." Samantha's heart stuttered. Was he really saying this? He continued, his tone now dripping with venom. "She betrayed me, and now I'm taking back what's mine." The word stung, but Samantha didn't flinch. She stood firm, her eyes locked on Jonathan's. She wasn't going to let him destroy her. This wasn't just a battle for her children. It was a battle for her soul, for her dignity, for everything she had fought for in the years since he had walked away. The final verdict would come soon, but Samantha knew one thing for sure: this fight wasn't over yet. As the days dragged on, Samantha could feel the weight of the court battle bearing down on her. She had been through so much: rejection, heartbreak, betrayal, but this was the final test. Would she survive this war with Jonathan? The legal decision was drawing near, and the clock was ticking. Samantha had never been more afraid in her life, but for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope deep within her. This time, she wasn't alone. Peter, her lawyer, had been a staunch ally, and even the kids, despite their innocence, had become her source of strength. The image of them, laughing, playing, trusting her, pushed her forward. Jonathan had come into her life like a storm, but now she would be the one to weather it, and when the judge finally rendered the verdict, it would be more than just a ruling. It would be the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of a new one, a life where Jonathan Carter would no longer control her future. The weeks leading up to the trial felt like a slow, suffocating descent into chaos. Samantha spent every waking hour preparing herself and her children, making sure they were shielded from the media frenzy and the looming legal battle. Jonathan, meanwhile, seemed to be everywhere, on TV interviews, in the papers, and in the courtrooms. His carefully cultivated image as a powerful, yet wounded, millionaire had the public on his side. But Samantha knew the truth: he had never been a man of integrity. He was a man who abandoned her, then returned to reclaim what he never truly wanted. Revenge star. In the quiet moments, when the children were asleep, Samantha would sit at her small kitchen table, staring at the legal papers, unsure of what the future held. The fear, the pressure, it was all building up to this. The trial. As the days passed, she found herself reliving every moment of her past with Jonathan. From their first meeting at that posh charity gala, to the way he made her feel like she was the only woman in the world. But it was all a facade. A dream that turned into a nightmare when he left her without so much as a goodbye. The trial would be her last chance to fight for what was hers: her children, her dignity, her peace. The courtroom was packed. Samantha had never seen so many people in one place. Photographers crowded the entryways, eager to capture every moment of the spectacle. Jonathan sat in his usual place at the plaintiff's table, calm and composed. His suit was perfectly tailored, his hair immaculately styled. He looked like a man who had everything under control. Samantha, on the other hand, felt like an outsider. She was dressed simply in a black dress, her eyes tired but determined. Peter Lawson, her lawyer, stood beside her, ready to take on Jonathan's formidable legal team. He had been her steadfast ally, but even he knew this battle would not be easy. The judge called the trial to order, and Jonathan's lawyer, Michael Drake, stood first to present their case. With a cold, calculated tone, Drake outlined Jonathan's claim, that he had been kept from his children for 5 years, and now that he was aware of their existence, he wanted the right to form a relationship with them. Jonathan Carter is a man of wealth, power, and influence, Drake said, his voice smooth. And he has the right to establish a bond with his children, whom he has been kept from due to the defendant's actions. Samantha could feel the weight of the words. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she held her ground. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for her children. Peter rose to counter the argument, his voice firm but calm. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about a father trying to claim his children. This is about a man who abandoned his family without a word and now, years later, seeks to upend their lives for his own selfish reasons. Samantha Blake has raised these children on her own, without the help of Mr. Carter. And she has done so with love, dedication, and sacrifice. The trial grew more intense with each passing day. The emotional stakes were higher than ever, especially when the first witnesses were called. Samantha's closest friends and family testified to the lengths she had gone to in order to provide for her children, to protect them from the fallout of Jonathan's abandonment, but it was the testimony of Emma, Samantha's eldest daughter, that struck a chord with the courtroom. The young girl, only 5 years old, was brave enough to speak about how her daddy had never been there to tuck her into bed or kiss her goodnight. Mommy said daddy was too busy, Emma said, her voice soft but clear. But I don't think he loves me, because he never came back. The room went silent. Tears welled in Samantha's eyes as she listened to her daughter's innocent words. Jonathan's face remained expressionless, but Samantha could see a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. He hadn't expected Emma to speak so candidly about the truth. After the emotional testimonies, it was Jonathan's turn to take the stand. He was a skilled manipulator, his charm disarming and his words measured. He spoke of how he had always wanted a family, but circumstances had prevented him from being there. He claimed that Samantha had kept him away, that she had isolated him from his children, and that it was only now, after years of soul-searching, that he wanted to be part of their lives. I'm not here to cause harm, Jonathan said, his voice low and sincere. I'm here because I've realized what's important. And I want to be the father my children deserve. Samantha's anger surged at the hypocrisy. This was the same man who had abandoned her without a word. This was the same man who had shown no interest in her or their children for 5 long years. His words were empty. Peter, sensing the manipulation, stood to cross-examine Jonathan. Mr. Carter, you've claimed to want a relationship with your children, but tell me, why didn't you come back sooner? Why did you wait until now, after 5 years of silence, to suddenly decide to be a father? Jonathan's jaw tightened. I had my reasons. Peter pressed harder. And those reasons, Mr. Carter, were never about your children, were they? They were about you, about your control, about revenge. As the trial neared its climax, both sides were preparing for their closing arguments. Samantha, emotionally drained but resolute, spent a sleepless night going over everything. She had poured her heart into her testimony. She had done everything she could to show the court what kind of mother she was. But was it enough? In a rare moment of solitude, Samantha walked through the quiet courthouse halls. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. What if she lost? What if Jonathan did get the rights to her children? But then she remembered her kids, Emma, Lucas, Noah, and Olivia. They were her heart. They were why she had fought so hard, why she had refused to give up. She stopped outside the courtroom door and took a deep breath. She wasn't going to let Jonathan win. Not this time. The final day of the trial arrived, and the tension was almost unbearable. Jonathan's lawyer, Michael Drake, made his closing argument first, painting Samantha as a manipulative mother who had intentionally kept Jonathan away from his children for selfish reasons. Peter Lawson stood up to make his argument. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what Jonathan Carter wants isn't just a relationship with his children. What he wants is to take back what he believes is his property. He abandoned Samantha when she needed him most. He abandoned his children. And now, after 5 years of silence, he thinks he can waltz back in and claim them as his own. The courtroom was still as Peter spoke. He went on, presenting the heart of the case. Samantha had been the one to raise the children, nurture them, and provide for them in every way. Jonathan had no right to come back and disrupt their lives. He had to prove himself first. He had to earn that right. The hours that followed felt like days. The jury deliberated. Samantha paced nervously in the waiting area, holding her breath. Her children played quietly, unaware of the weight of the situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to the courtroom opened, and the judge entered. The room stood in silence as he made his way to the bench. He called for order. The jury has reached a verdict. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. She could barely breathe. The judge looked up, his face unreadable. In the case of Samantha Blake versus Jonathan Carter, the jury has found in favor of the defendant, Samantha Blake. A wave of relief washed over her, and her knees buckled. She felt the tears well up as she turned to look at her children, their faces filled with confusion and joy. Jonathan sat frozen, his face drained of color. His legal team exchanged looks of disbelief. He had lost. And Samantha had won. The courtroom buzzed with the whispers of the shocked spectators. Samantha, still in a daze, gathered her children and left the courtroom, her heart swelling with emotion. She had won. She had protected her family. As she stepped out into the sunlight, the weight of the past 5 years began to lift. Jonathan Carter no longer had any power over her. She was free. Her children were free. Samantha smiled as she looked down at her children, their laughter filling the air. They were her world. And no matter what came next, she would face it with the strength and love that had carried her through everything. This was just the beginning of their new life, a life that belonged to her and her children, and no one else.